That's a crazy idea. Move closer to the front? My God. So, one of the highest compliments I can get after I do one of these presentations, and I expect to hear this afterwards, is that I stayed awake for the whole thing. That's why I'm setting the bar pretty low. Anyway, this is just a little AA trivia for you. It's Bill and Dr. Silkworth were both stationed at Fort Plattsburgh in 1917 in the spring. Now, what I used to say was that Bill and Dr. Silkworth were there at the same time. Well, there's a friend of mine that some of you may know. He's a good history guy named Roger W. in Kentucky. He was a career Army guy. He was stationed at Fort Knox. He separated from the service, but he still works at Fort Knox now. But his little niche in AA history is AA in the military. And so I was listening to one of his presentations once, and he mentioned that Bill and Dr. Silkworth were in Fort Plattsburgh, but he said they were not there at the same time. And I had always used to say they were there at the same time because that's what my research and notes were telling me. So we did like history people do. I didn't call them up on the phone and say, "You're wrong," or anything like that. Even though we love to stick to a good story. I don't blame anybody for that. But if you're going to be kind of a history guy, you have to be open to new information and maybe change. And so I called him on the phone, and I told him that I thought that they had been there at the same time. So he got his notes out, and I got my notes out, and we had this long discussion. And here's where we landed on that. And I hope he's keeping up his part of the deal. He was going to stop saying that they weren't there at the same time, and I was going to stop saying they were there at the same time because there's just enough doubt. So if anybody knows him and you see that presentation sometimes and he says they were definitely not there at the same time, give me a call. Let me know, because I'm going to call him up. There were also some other people there. Does the name Richard Peabody mean anything to you? Anybody in here? He was actually there at the same time. Oops, did I say at the same time? He was also there in the spring of 1917. So anyway, Dr. Silkworth was helping the, what did they call it? The psychologically wounded, which later would become, shell shock and post-traumatic stress disorder. He was always trying to help people, always trying to help people. Here's a picture of towns as it looked back in the day and as it looks today. Now, because I'm such a smart guy, I threw them two slides in there that don't have anything to do with anything, because I know when people come back for the break, it takes them a minute. So there you go. Founding moment number 4, Bill and Dr. Bob meet, Akron, Ohio. Okay, we got a lot going on here. We got Dr. Bob's house in the upper left-hand corner. Of course, Dr. Bob. Down in the lower left-hand corner is a very important house that belongs to T. Henry and Clarice Williams. And the house in the middle was called the Gate Lodge, or the Gate House, and it was on the grounds of the Cyberling Estate in Akron. And this is the house where Bill and Bob would actually meet. So we got some things to talk about here. Now, what in the world did Thomas Edison and Harvey Firestone have to do with the founding of Alcoholics Anonymous in Fort Myers, Florida? Well, not, indirectly they do have something, and I'm so glad you asked. I will help explain it. See this guy here, his name's Jim Newton. He was a real young guy when he would have play his part in what would become the founding of Alcoholics Anonymous. Even a lot of people that know history pretty good aren't aware of who this fella is. He was born in Philadelphia in 1905. His father was a dentist or a doctor, I can't remember which, so it was a well-off family. He was a really hard worker. He was very, very smart. Jim had probably one of the most natural business minds on the planet. The guy was just a natural when it came to business. And Jim would sell luggage during high school. In the summer times, he would sell luggage up and down the East Coast. And he made a lot of money doing it, and he really impressed the heck out of the company. And so when he graduated from high school, the company offered him a full-time job that was paying pretty good. So, he asked his folks, do you mind if I sort of skip college for a minute here? And they said, well, okay, go for it. So he did. So he was on a business/pleasure trip up in Wichita, Massachusetts, and he was staying at a place called the Toy Town Tavern. He was going to do some skiing, and he had some business to take care of. Now, I drank in some taverns, and none of them look like that. That looks like a resort to me. But nonetheless, They called it a tavern, and he was up there, and he's really young. He's only like 19 or 20 years old. And he sees there's a large group there of college students, so they're just about his age. And so he noticed that there were some attractive women there as well. That got his attention. I mean, he's like just a normal guy. And at dinner one night, the manager of the hotel comes into the dining room and says there's going to be a dance after dinner. And so Jim's thinking, whoa, man, that'll be awesome. You know, I mean, he wasn't an alcoholic. He wasn't us. And you know, he didn't have all the problems we have. But, you know, even normal people, believe it or not, they have some anxiety, especially at that age. What am I going to do with my life? And all, we just have all that stuff like on steroids. But, you know, normal people have it too. And so anyway, he's kind of lonely. And he's hoping, well, maybe I can do some dancing and meet some of these, you know, young girls I'm seeing walking around here. I mean, this could sound kind of sick and stalky, like I don't mean it to. But anyway, so he goes upstairs and he changes his clothes and he comes back downstairs for the dance. And he sees two girls that he had noticed at dinner. And so he figures they're going to the dance. I mean, why not? Why wouldn't they? So he follows them down the hallway, and they turn into this room, and he falls right in behind them, and he walks smack dab into the middle of an Oxford group meeting. Man, talk about a buzzkill. I mean, you're looking for a little dancing, maybe get lucky, and so what do? You know, like, so he sat down, and he listened. And remember when I said last night, whenever we say long story short, we're lying? Well, anyway, long story short, is he just was captivated by the Oxford group message. It just resonated with him. It brought him some measure of comfort and peace inside that he hadn't experienced in his young life. And so he is all in with the Oxford group now. So what we're talking about for the next few minutes here is how the Oxford group gets to Akron. Because if there's no Oxford group in Akron, we're not sitting here today. We're not sitting here today. So that's why this is important. Jim was a real go-getter, and he decided he was going to start a realty business, and he saw some land down in Florida directly across from the Edison estate in Fort Myers, and he was going to buy some of this land up and start developing it. For those of you that maybe have been down that way, you know, you got Edison Park this, Edison Park that. Well, Jim's your guy. He's the guy who started all this. And so when the land boom in Florida turned a little bit to a bust, he was looking for work, and he had met the Edisons previously. See this statue right there? And all of that is still there. It's more like mature trees behind it. It's all, you know, grown around it and stuff, but those steps and that statue are still there. Well, initially, this was the entrance to his Edison Park development that he was building. Initially, that statue, it was naked. Didn't have no clothes on it, and Mrs. Edison was not having it. She was not having that statue across from her house. She was not having it, so she demands to see the man in charge. And so Jim shows up. He's like 20, you know, and she said, no, son, I need to talk to your father or somebody. I need to talk to the man who is in charge. So they have a little back and forth, and finally he convinces her, I'm the guy. This is my deal. I'm the realtor here. And so they discussed. She expressed why she didn't like it, and he took care of it. I'm told that the sculptor just about had a fit when he came back to him and said, hey, we got to make some changes here. But anyway, they got it done. And when the land boom turned into a bust and things slowed down, Mr. Edison, who had become kind of fond of Jim because he'd met him and he became a guest at their house, and Edison recognized the mind that this guy had. And so he would give him tasks to do. I mean little tasks. I mean big tasks, not little tasks. He would put together these huge events on the Edison estate and things, and he did really, really well. Now, one of the frequent visitors was Harvey Firestone. He had a place over in Miami, but he was a frequent visitor at the Edisons, and he had observed Jim too and struck up a friendship with him, and he also recognized Jim's special abilities. And in the driveway of the Edison estate one day, one of them was leaving, one of them was coming, I can't remember which way, but they engaged in a conversation, and what Jim didn't know was that he was being interviewed for a job. And a couple of weeks later, Mr. Firestone sends him a letter and invites him to come work for him. And so Jim talked it over with his father. His father was retired by then, and so he said he would look after the land project down there in Florida. Go for it. So up to Akron he goes to work for Mr. Firestone of Firestone Tires. And Jim thought that Mr. Firestone was going to hire him as a real estate guy. maybe go out and buy up land for some Firestone repair stations and things like that. But no, Harvey Firestone had bigger ideas for Jim. He was making him his right-hand man. He really recognized his abilities, and so they became very close. And so Mr. Firestone had a son. His name was Russell. His nickname was Bud. And Bud was a little bit older than Jim, but not much, and Bud and Jim became very close. And Bud had a little problem. Anybody care to guess what it was? Yeah, he was one of us. He was one of us. And of course, he did what we do to the people that love us. He was just breaking his father's heart. And Mr. Firestone asked Jim, is there anything you can do to help him? Anything you can do to help him? And Jim, he doesn't know. He doesn't know anything about alcoholism, but man, he tried hard, man. He went to drying out places with him. He went to exercise farms, tried nutrition. I mean, just everything. He tried everything to help Bud. He doesn't know how to help an alcoholic, and nothing was working. Nothing was working. At the time, there was going to be a large Episcopal Bishops' Conference in Denver, and there was going to be a large Oxford group presence. And Jim thought it might be a good idea if he and Bud attended it. And so he asked Mr. Firestone, can I take Bud to Denver? And Mr. Firestone said, sure, please, take him somewhere, help him. And on the train to Denver, Jim is literally detoxing Bud by giving him teaspoons of whiskey on the train ride. So they get to Denver. Long story short, Bud is just captivated by the Oxford group message as well. He gives his life over. He stops drinking. He is all in. He is all in. The predecessor to our third step was in the Oxford group, where they would call it making your surrender. And on the train ride back to Akron, Jim astutely steers Bud to the private rail car of none other than our very own Sam Shoemaker. And Bud would make his surrender in the private rail car of Sam Shoemaker. When they get back to Akron, Mr. Firestone is so exhilarated about the change he sees in his son. He wants to do something for the Oxford group. But what? So what he wound up doing, this was in 31, by the way, late 31, December of 31, that this Denver trip happened. It took a couple of years to put together, but what he did was he underwrote what would be an Oxford group convention in Akron, in the Mayflower Hotel, no less. And so he invites him up there, and this would be in 1933. And so this is how the Oxford group gets established in Akron, Ohio. It was in all the papers. A sharp eye would know that that's not from 1933. That was a later one, but shh, don't tell anybody. I like the headline. So anyway, so now the Oxford group is set in Akron. It is established in Akron. They left some people behind to show them how to do meetings. They called them house parties, but they were basically like our meetings. So they left a couple people behind, and on Thursday nights in the West Hills section of Akron, there was one of these house parties / meetings, and there were some very, very important people that attended that Thursday night meeting. Our very own Dr. Bob and his wonderful wife, Ann, or Annie as everybody called her. Ann had gone to the Oxford group event at Mayflower, and she brought Dr. Bob in, and they were attending this meeting. A woman named Henrietta Seiberling was also attending that Thursday night meeting in the West Hills section of Akron. Henrietta Seiberling was born in Kentucky. She was raised in Texas. She was the daughter of a judge. She was crazy smart. She attended Vassar College when she was only 15 years old. She had a major in music and a minor in psychology. Henrietta was the kind of person where you didn't have to guess where you stood with her. It was she wore her feelings on her sleeve, and she was like, she would let you know what she thought. She was not shy, and she was like a go-getter, man. And she was married to the son of the founder of the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company, Frank Seiberling. So she married his son, and they were living on this big estate that you can visit now. But her marriage was strained, and she had moved out of the big 65-room mansion, and she moved in to what would be the gatehouse. At one time, that had been the landscaping superintendent's residence, but now she lives there. So she leaves her husband, and she moves into the house right there on her property. Another woman that attended that Thursday night meeting was a woman named Delphine Weber. Don't know a lot about her other than that her husband was involved with the Akron school system, specifically King School Group. That might be important to some of you. You recognize that name. And after one of these Thursday night meetings, Delphine approaches Henrietta, and she says, what are we going to do about Dr. Bob's drinking? Dr. Bob was Dr. Bob before AA, by the way. And Henrietta thought she knew Dr. Bob pretty well. She says, well, what do you mean? What are you talking about? She said, well, he's a drunk. He's going to lose everything. He's going to lose his house. He's going to lose his practice. He's going to lose everything. What are we going to do? Well, Henrietta was the kind of person where you can't present a problem to her and not expect her to act. She's going to act. She's going to do something. She knows nothing about alcoholism, but man, she's going to do something. So you know how in AA we get voluntold to do things? Well, T. Henry and Clarice Williams, and here's a little question, here's a little trivia for you history sleuths out there. I have not been able to find out what the T stands for. It sounds really simple, doesn't it? You should be able to figure that out. So if anybody can figure out what the T stood for, please let me know. I will really, really appreciate it. But T. Henry and Clarice Williams, they attended that Oxford Group convention too. They're non-alcoholics, and they also went to that Thursday night meeting. So Henrietta voluntold T. Henry and Clarice, we're going to have a special meeting on Wednesday nights in your house. And this is the origination, this is the start of what would become the King School Group. AA group number 1, unless you're from Cleveland, AA group number 1 that still meets to this day on Wednesday nights. In fact, I go up every year for their group anniversary. I enjoy that. I enjoy that better than Founders Day, actually. So anyway, didn't want that to get recorded. So anyway, one of the, I guess criticism's probably too strong a word, but one of the things Henrietta kind of didn't like about these Oxford Group meetings were they were just too superficial. They were just too superficial. And so she wanted a meeting with a little more depth to it, where people shared at a deeper level. And so she goes to the Williams here, and she says, we're going to have a special meeting on Wednesday nights, and what we're going to do, we're going to share at a very, very deep level. And her hope was she was going to draw Dr. Bob out about his drinking. Let's see if Henrietta will explain it to us, what her plan was.
And so we did all share very deeply our shortcomings and what we'd had victory over. And then it was silence, and I waited, and I thought, will Bob say anything? And sure enough, he said, well, in this deep, serious tone of his, you good people have shared things that I'm sure are very costly to you. And I'm going to tell you something that may cost me may cost me my profession, that's the thing. And alcoholics always laugh at this. And he said, I'm a silent drinker. And I can't stop.
So it worked, right? Dr. Bob came out with it. He says, I got a problem, and I don't know what to do. I can't do anything by myself. In the Oxford Group, they would have quiet time before the meetings. You know, I just want to get this out of the way real quick. It is a true statement that Alcoholics Anonymous would not exist had it not been for the Oxford Group. It is also a true statement that Alcoholics Anonymous would not exist had we not split from the Oxford Group. You can do a whole presentation on that. So I'm just going to leave that right there for now. But at in the Oxford Group meetings, they would have a silent time, quiet time they called it, where they would be receiving guidance. And then they would share their guidance. One of the reasons the alcoholics wound up leaving is because it was always the non-alcoholics that were getting the guidance, and the guidance was always about them. But anyway, that's beyond the scope of this presentation. So Henrietta receives some guidance, and she contacts Dr. Bob, and she says, Bob, I've received some guidance on what to do about your drinking. And he's excited. He's like, wow, really? So they got together, and she says, Bob, my guidance is that you should never, ever, ever touch another drop of alcohol. That was it. That's the guidance. Dr. Bob, he bows his head and his shoulders slump, and he shakes his head a little bit, and he says, he called her Henry. He said, Henry, do you believe that I want to stop drinking? And she said, of course you do. I know with all of your heart you do, Bob, of course. And he said something really important. He said, I just don't understand it. I just don't understand it. And then he said, nobody understands. That was about to change because a few weeks later, our very own Bill W. from New York City would arrive on the scene. Now, Bill had been in New York, and he'd been trying to get people sober and bringing them back to the house, and Lois is cooking and still working and all this stuff, and there were some crazy stories about, bringing people to your house. It's not always wise. I know it's a good thing, and your heart's in the right place. Sometimes it works out just great. It was necessary and appropriate, and you hit a home run, man. That guy's, he's got it now. There's been plenty of cases where people are getting chased around their house with some raving lunatic with a knife in his hand. So you need to think about that very carefully before you take somebody into your house. So Lois and then later Ann, they were both experiencing this. And nobody's getting sober. Nobody is getting sober. Lois is working. Bill's not working, because he's running around trying to help all these drunks. He's stalking the halls of town's hospitals. He's bringing people back to the house. And two things happened before he made this trip to Akron. One of them, I'm sad to say, may be AA urban legend because there's no evidence of it. She never mentioned it in any of her talks. Bill never mentioned it in any of his talks. It's not written down anywhere. But we are told that when Bill was lamenting to Lois about nobody getting sober, that she said to him, but Bill, don't you see, you're staying sober. I hope that's true, but there's actually no evidence of it. I hope it's true. But what is without question is he was lamenting to Dr. Silkworth as well. And Dr. Silkworth, normally very mild manner, not an in-your-face kind of guy, he got serious for a second. He sort of moved in on Bill, and he said, well, I'll tell you what the problem is. Bill's like, what? He says, you're scaring them. You're coming on too strong. You're talking about your spiritual experience. We got white lights. We got mountaintops and stuff. You're scaring them. They can't get away from you fast enough. He says, you gotta hit them with the facts. Let them know about their hopelessness. Talk about alcoholism first, and then slide in the solution. So, okay, I got that in my head now. Bill does before he goes out. Some of Lois's relatives have been expressing their joy that Bill is now sober, but they were also expressing the thought, is he ever going to get a job? Is this guy ever going to go back to work? Bill had his pride, and, he was a natural on Wall Street. I just crack up when people say, Bill was just making money off of AA. A sober Bill Wilson on Wall Street would have been a millionaire many times over, trust me. So he went sniffing around Wall Street. And he found this proxy fight that was going to take place out in Akron. It was right up his alley. Bill was very good at what he did. Very good at what he did. This is going to be a slam dunk piece of cake, going to bring some money in. And so he and a couple other guys, they head out to Akron. And there are some AA historians that can tell you every minute by minute, hour by hour detail of that whole proxy fight. I'm not that interested in it, but if you are, you can find out. But the upshot was the other side did some underhanded, illegal stuff. Bill knew it. He knew what they had done, but he couldn't prove it. He couldn't do a darn thing, and so the whole deal fell apart. So the guys he was with had gone back to New York. They left him behind to see if he could salvage anything. This would be Mother's Day weekend, 1935, and Bill's staying at the Mayflower Hotel. It's always amazing to me how 19 years before I was born, in the span of a couple of minutes in a hotel lobby in Akron, Ohio, my life was saved. If you're a sober member of Alcoholics Anonymous, your life was saved. There were things that happened in a period of just a couple of minutes that would actually be a foundation for our program of recovery. Bill was pacing. We all know the story. Bill's pacing the lobby, and he's hearing there's a bar at one end, a church directory at the other, and he's hearing the laughter in there, and he can hear the ice cubes hitting the side of the glass. And for the first time in 5 months, he wants a drink. The obsession is coming on. He's like, oh, man. So he goes over and he says, well, maybe I can go in and just have a ginger ale. Oh, no, can't do that. He walked away. One of the things he had learned from Dr. Silkworth, which is kind of has to do with our second step where they use the word insanity, was that it was the insanity isn't the things we do once we're drunk. I mean, you put enough booze in Mary Poppins, she's going to make the front page. I mean, it's not everybody act like a fool when they're drunk. The insanity is the thinking that precedes the first drink. I was sober every time I took that first drink. So that's the insanity they're talking about, and Bill understood this. Now I'm using AA language here, but that was what Dr. Silkworth had explained to Bill. So then he knows he's on thin ice, and then he goes back to the bar again. I mean, it's just drawing him, man. It's just drawing him. And he listens and he looks in there again, and he says, maybe I can have just a couple. Now he knows he is in trouble. So he recognizes the insanity as the thinking preceding the first drink. He knows that what kept him sober in New York was working with other alcoholics. So he knows he needs another alcoholic. That's what this thing's built on. That's what this thing's built on. So let's let Bill explain it. This audio picks up with him realizing he's in trouble in the hotel lobby there.
And I thought to myself, now I need an alcoholic just as bad as he could possibly need me. I'm in danger of getting drunk. I must find another alcoholic in this town, and right now. I called a preacher. He was a little puzzled that I was a drunk from New York who wished to find some drunks to work on. Drunks one at a time seemed enough to him. But he finally caught on, and through a series of providential circumstance, I'm face to face with Dr. Bob in the home of a non-alcoholic. One who understood, and one who cared enough. Dr. Bob and Ann had entered that room at about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Bob couldn't stay but a minute. But we talked for 5 hours. And this time, there was real mutuality. I told him at once, please stay. I need you as much as you could possibly need me.
I'm always impressed with, from our earliest literature being a big book all the way up to our latest pamphlets on sponsorship, is that we're always encouraged to tell the person that we're trying to help that they're helping us, that we need them as much as they need us. And I can remember my own sponsor saying that to me. You know, when I'm thanking him profusely for taking me to my first meeting, he says, no, thank you. Thank you. He says, you might not understand this yet, but I need you as much as you need me. And so I'm always impressed by that. So Saturday, the day before Mother's Day, is when Bill made the phone call. And he called Reverend Tunks, which he picked at random. And it is sometimes reported that the 10th name on it, so Reverend Tunks gives him a list of 10 names. It is sometimes reported that Henrietta's name was the 10th name on the list. We think that because Bill used to say that in talks. Henrietta would later speculate he just did that to speed things along, like I know some of you wish I would do right now. But the 10th name on the list was actually a guy named Norman Shepard, and he had attended that Wednesday night meeting, and he knew what Henrietta was trying to do with Dr. Bob. So he calls Henrietta that Saturday afternoon, and he explains what's going on, and she invites him over right away. And so there was a big debate about, historians are so funny, you know, how did Bill get to Henrietta's? You know, like, that's that important? But anyway, they went on, but on the history lovers, boy, they went on with that for a couple of months. Turns out he took the bus. Anyway, so he goes over to Henrietta's, and while he's on the way over, Henrietta calls over to Dr. Bob's house, and Ann answers the phone, and she says, I found somebody that can help Bob. Please get him over here right away. And Ann sort of stammers and started, well, it's not really a good time. We can't come over right now. You all know the story. Dr. Bob was passed out drunk. So finally Ann says, nothing's happening with him today. We are not going to make it over there. And so Henrietta said, okay, come back tomorrow. And when Bill got there and Dr. Bob wasn't there, he and Henrietta had dinner. And she said, come back in the morning, we'll go to church and we'll come back. And then, Bob and Ann will come over. And so that's what happened. So it was Mother's Day. And when Bill and Bob first met, both men, just a point of description, doesn't really mean anything, but both men were well over 6 feet tall and had blue eyes, and they were both from Vermont. And when they met and they shook hands, and Dr. Bob's hungover, man. He's in the doghouse, so he said he would go over here to Henrietta's, but he wasn't going to stay more than 15 minutes. He wasn't interested in talking to this mug from New York or anybody else. But anyway, he's kind of got to do what he's got to do because he messed up the day before. So when they shake hands and when their hands parted, Dr. Bob's hands were shaking, and Bill noticed that. And Bill looked Dr. Bob in the eyes, and he says, "Look like you could use a drink." And Dr. Bob just peered into Bill's eyes like, "Who is this guy? Nobody's ever talked to me like that." And so they go into the house, and they're in the dining room, and they have dinner, and which Dr. Bob hardly ate at all, because you know how it is, your stomach be all tore up. So Dr. Bob didn't eat much. And then Henrietta wisely put them in a little library that's off the living room. And this is the library where they sat and talked for 5 hours. And what Bill did was he did exactly what Dr. Silkworth had told him to do. He told him about the medical fact. You're talking to a doctor here. This took something. I mean, Bill had some, anyway. He starts giving him the medical facts. But this was a revelation to Dr. Bob. He didn't know it. So, and he stresses the hopelessness and the medical facts, and you're up against something you can't fight. And then he slides in the solution. And Bill basically told his story so that all-important identification was happening. Identification has to happen before healing can take place. And this process started in this little library you're looking at right here all those years ago. And Bill finally ran out of gas, It's hard to believe, but he did. He's getting ready to leave. And when he's getting ready to leave, Dr. Bob says, "Hold up." He said, "I've been listening to you for a couple hours. Now you're going to listen to me." And for the first time in Dr. Bob's life, he poured his soul out to another person. Because Bill knew, that's the power our stories carry. That's the power that we have, that power of identification. Dr. Bob knew without a doubt, and he says it in his story, this guy knew all about the drinking game, and he didn't learn about it in a book. He didn't learn about it in a book. So Bill, this is the caption under there used to say, "The library as it looks today." I stop at Akron at least once a year. I go in July, I go to the King School Group's anniversary, which I really love doing that. But I have sat in that room for as long as 45 minutes, totally uninterrupted. Me and my friends, I grab some friends, we go up every July, and we sat in that house for like almost 2 hours this past July, and we had a meeting. It was great. I love Founders Day, but you can't do that on Founders Day. But we did it. You have the town to yourself when you go any other time. So anyway, they're sneaky up there, though. So this is what the library looks like today. So I had to change that caption on the last one. Notice that the clock is at 5 o'clock. That's when they came over. And when I used to go there years ago, sometimes that clock didn't say 5 o'clock. I mean, it's busted. It doesn't work. I don't know who was messing with it, but you can believe it was set at 5 o'clock after I left. I ain't telling you who did it. Now, you can't see it in the picture, but they put a little piece of wire around it now. You can't open it up to adjust the time. The chair on the right was donated by some of the Cyberling descendants, and it's their belief that chair was one of the chairs that was in the library the night Dr. Bob and Bill met. So that's pretty cool. All right, so Bill would stay somewhere else for another few days, and then he would actually move in to 855 Ardmore and stay with Dr. Bob and Ann. And they would sit up late at night drinking coffee, thinking about ways to try to help alcoholics. But clearly, if AA's birth date's June 10th, and this was Mother's Day weekend a month earlier, what happened? Well, we all know the story. Dr. Bob had one more little drinky poo in him. He used to go to a AMA convention in New Jersey every year, never missed one. And when that came up again, Dr. Bob asked Ann and Bill, well, do you think I should go? And Ann, being the smartest one in the house, says, no, you shouldn't go. All those people do is drink over there. No, bad idea, don't do it. And Bill was always about, well, we live in a world with alcohol, we can't hide from it, so I think you ought to go. And so Dr. Bob went. He's drinking on the train before he even gets to New Jersey. And in his words, he left a few days early so not to embarrass himself. And he winds up sneaking back to Akron in a little town on the outskirts into his receptionist's house. And he calls down there to the house, and everybody knew what happened. So this is a talk that Dr. Bob gave. And I love the way he kind of, I had a little hooker or two of scotch, and then I do it. Let's let Dr. Bob explain it.
But very shortly after that, there was a medical meeting in Atlantic City. And I developed a terrific thirst for knowledge. I had to have knowledge. I would go to Atlantic City and absorb lots of knowledge. I usually mention the fact that I incidentally had acquired a thirst for scotch, but I didn't mention that. But anyway, I went to Atlantic City and really hung one on. And when I came to, I was in the home of a friend of ours in Cuyahoga Falls, one of our suburbs. Bill came over and got me home, gave me a hooker or two of scotch that night and a bottle of beer the next morning. And that was on the 10th of June of 35, and I have had no alcohol in any form that I know of since.
Well, so that's what happened, Bob. Some of you may have heard that AA's real birth date is actually June 17th, not June 10th. That may be true. It turns out that the timing of the medical convention that year and the timeline we have just don't quite line up. So we're probably a week off. I still use June 10th because I really don't care whether it was June 10th or June 17th. But just if and it's still, until AA says it changes it, I'm going with June 10th. So if any of you hear that it's really June 17th, don't get in a fight with them. They may be right. So leave it alone. So I love that I had a hooker or two of scotch, like it's no big deal. So they go and they get them. When Dr. Bob called down to the house, Bill could overhear Ann, and he knew what happened. And Ann was hot. I mean, she was not happy. Bill is literally packing his bags like, well, I guess my work here is done. He's going to leave. He ain't no fool. But she stopped him. She said, don't go. Yeah, I'm not happy. I'm not happy about this. I knew this was a bad idea. But you two guys, you're on to something. Please don't go. So they go up and they get Dr. Bob and they bring him back to the house there at 855 Ardmore. And they went up in that room that you see pictured on the left. And Bill basically tapered Dr. Bob off. He's giving him the old K-Ro syrup, stewed tomatoes, and little teaspoons of whiskey deal. And until Bob, was getting a little better. That Monday morning, Dr. Bob was to perform surgery. He was a rectal surgeon, and he was supposed to perform surgery. And so that Monday morning, they wake up, and Bill wakes up, and he sees Dr. Bob sitting on the side of the bed holding his hands out like that. And Dr. Bob noticed Bill noticing him, and he says, I'm going to go through with it. I'm going to go through with everything. And Bill says, you mean the operation? Because he had an operation scheduled for that Monday morning. And he said, no, yeah, I'm going to do the operation, but that's not what I'm talking about. There's a clue in a vision for you that tells you, we didn't have the 12 steps, but restitution was part of the Oxford group prescription here. And Dr. Bob balked at that. In a vision for you, he says, I'll do anything but that. And then he gets drunk. So now, that Monday morning, he's not just talking about going through with the surgery. He's talking about going through with everything. So they get Dr. Bob together as good as they can. They go out to the car, and they drive to the hospital, and they drop Dr. Bob off, and Bill gives them a bottle of beer and what they used to call goofballs. And in the old days, a lot of the guys would carry goofballs in their pockets. It was usually barbiturates, and you hear it, anyway, I don't want to get off on that. But anyway, so he gives them a bottle of beer and some goofballs to go do his surgery. And so Bill and Ann go back to the house and they wait. And just a few hours later, Dr. Bob calls. And he says, the surgery went well. I'll be back in a little bit. Now, there's some discrepancies about a little bit. What was that? Was it 5 or 6 in the evening, or was it as late as 10 o'clock or so? It doesn't matter. Enough time went by where Bill and Ann are worried to death. Oh, man, what is he doing? Where is he? Why isn't he here? Now, there's a couple of things that are not suggested on the day of your last drink. One of them is performing surgery. And another one is don't go running around town making all your amends. Yep, but he did it, and he never drank again, so it worked for him, and that's what he had been doing. He came back to the house, and he said that that's what he had been doing. So I'm going to fast forward here. When I do this as a standalone presentation, I like to fast forward 15 years to Dr. Bob's passing. So this was the birth of Alcoholics Anonymous in Akron, Ohio in June of 1935. Lois and Ann don't get talked about enough. We would not be here if it wasn't for these two. In those early days, Ann at the house over on Ardmore, she led the meetings. Bill and Bob would be bringing these drunks into the house, and she would lead the meetings. She would pick the topic, usually out of the Bible, and she would lead the meetings. She kept those guys glued together. She really did. We wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Ann. And then back in New York, when Bill went back to New York in August of that summer, Lois was doing the same thing, and she had already been doing that. We owe them so much. There's a woman out in California that does a presentation on pioneer women in Alcoholics Anonymous. If you ever run across it, attend it. And if it's on Zoom or something, we'll zoom on in. So we can't say enough good things about them. In 1950, Ann, by the way, would die unexpectedly in 1949. In 1948, Dr. Bob had been diagnosed with what would be terminal cancer. And then in 1949, after a trip to Texas, Ann became suddenly ill, and she would pass away in St. Thomas Hospital. And of course, this just broke Dr. Bob's heart. He's dying himself, and now he loses the love of his life, a woman that he just can't imagine living without. It's a very, very tough time. In 1950, we had our first convention up in Cleveland, and this would be Dr. Bob's last talk, and I think it's real important. He was a man of few words, but his words counted. It was a short talk, and this is just a part of it, and so let's listen.
Our 12 steps, when simmered down to the last, resolve themselves into the words love and service. We understand what love is, and we understand what service is. So let's bear those two things in mind. Let us also remember to guard that erring member of the tongue. And if we must use it, let's use it with kindness and consideration and tolerance.
Man, I love those words. Sometimes Dr. Bob is perceived as the tough one. I'd rather step on your feelings than step on your grave, that kind of stuff. And you know what? I'm not hearing that. I'm not hearing that. And I'm hearing about a guy that's full of love, and he's talking about, treating people with kindness and consideration and tolerance. In other part of this talk, he talks about encouraging the newcomer. Give them a pat on the back. And remember, you're not doing anything for them that wasn't done for you. So that's the Dr. Bob I know and love. A few months later, in November of 1950, getting up to Cleveland for that took everything out of Dr. Bob. He could barely make it. A few months later, in early November, Bill would pay one last visit to his friend, a man that he had come to love, Dr. Bob. The meeting had a couple of reasons. One was, of course, the main one, he wanted to see Bob before he passed away. He knew time was getting close. But there was something else going on, too. Bill had been trying to get this conference idea going. And the folks in Akron, they were a little slow to change. They didn't like change. They did not like change. They were not happy about this conference idea. They weren't having any of it. And Bill knew that without Dr. Bob's support, the conference idea was dead. It's not going to go anywhere. So he wanted to talk to him about that as well. So y'all see that? Remember that old movie with James Garner and I forget the other guy's name. My Name is Bill W. Well, in the beginning of that movie, as they portray this visit in the beginning, and the rest of the movie is flashback, Dr. Bob's in bed and he can barely speak, and Bill's sitting next to him, patting him like that. I guess they did that for dramatic effect, but the truth to me is more dramatic. Dr. Bob was up. He was dressed in a light gray suit, and he and Bill talked for hours that afternoon, for hours. And finally, Dr. Bob agreed to support the conference idea. He thought it would be a good thing after all. And when they're done talking, they walk out to the porch where you see Bill sitting, and they're standing at the door there, and they're shaking hands, and they're looking into each other's eyes. And both men knew they had just made their last decision together as co-founders of Alcoholics Anonymous. They also knew they may be looking at each other for the last time. And so when their hands parted and Bill walked down the stairs that you see Dr. Bob sitting on, he gets to the bottom step, and Dr. Bob says, "Remember, Bill." And Bill stopped and turned and he looked at him. He said, "Let's don't louse this thing up. Let's keep it simple. Let's keep it simple." Bill was so overcome with emotion he could just manage a smile, a wink, maybe a thumbs up. And he knew he was looking at Dr. Bob for the last time. These two men really loved each other. We needed both of them. We needed Bill's big ideas, and we needed Dr. Bob to put the brakes on them. You know, Bill was the only guy on the planet that could draw Dr. Bob out of his comfort zone. Conversely, Dr. Bob was the only guy on the planet that could put the brakes on some of Bill's big ideas. We needed both of these guys. They complemented each other beautifully, beautifully. So as Bill walked away, and he knew that he had just was looking at his good friend for the last time, and in fact, Dr. Bob would die the following Thursday. I'm so grateful that the hand of Providence saw fit to put these two men together and create this wonderful thing we call Alcoholics Anonymous. I don't know how to calculate how many lives Alcoholics Anonymous has affected. I mean, there's us, we're the alcoholics who get well, we stop drinking, there's our lives, but then there's the people that love us. And for almost 9 decades now. So there's 2 million people in AA right now, they say, but the lives affected over the last 9 almost decades, I don't know how you calculate that. It's got to be in the tens of millions of people have been affected by Alcoholics Anonymous. We have a strong obligation to keep this thing going. You know, Bill was often asked, how long will this thing last? And his stock answer was, as long as God intends it to. As long as we don't forget what we're doing here. As long as we don't forget what we're doing here. So we have an obligation to these people. They were planning this thing and building this thing before I was born. You know, Dr. Burns Smith gave this great talk. It's commonly referred to as Why Do We Need a Conference? The actual name was something else. It was The Lost Commandment. But he talks about why we need a conference. And one of the things he says is we need it for the child being born just a few blocks from here tonight, destined for alcoholism. He gave that talk when I was about 6 weeks old. About 6 weeks old. It's so powerful. We have such an obligation. It's easy to say, well, God would have picked 2 other people. If it wasn't Bill and Bob, it would have been somebody else. Maybe, but we can't know that. And would it have been in time for us? I don't know. All I know is I am filled with gratitude, and I desperately want to be part of the hand that is there when someone reaches out.
May God bless and keep you and Alcoholics Anonymous forever.
Well, I don't know about y'all, but I had fun. Thank y'all so much for inviting me. I really, really appreciate it.